Thank you so much, colleagues. Warm welcome here from the OECD, but obviously also on behalf of IISD. Great to have you all here. Thanks for joining. And obviously very, very warm welcome to our webinar on building climate resilience through collaboration across scales. So it's really great to see you all connecting, and we are really, really happy to have you with us. So I'm Harshit, I'm heading the work here at the OECD on financing for development. We here at the OECD have really the great pleasure to coordinate this event with the colleagues from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, who, as you probably will know, hosts the National Adaptation Plan, the NAP Global Network, and it has been a really great partnership with IISD for us. It's really my great honor to be joined by a very, very distinguished panelists from governments, donor agencies, academia, and civil society today, and I will say a few words a bit later. Before I have two of my dear colleagues setting the scene and providing you a bit of an overview, and thereafter we go to the panel discussion, let me say a few words about the context of this webinar. As we all read, as we all know, the summary of the recently released IPCC assessment report, I think really pictures a very, very grim picture that obviously climate change is impacting every region on our planet. Looking at the newspapers, we are aware of rising temperature rise, impacts of hurricanes, floods, wildfires, droughts, sea level rise, glacier retreat, ocean warming, and the like. The list can be long, and it's certainly not a positive and inspiring way. Those unprecedented events and the scale of those really shows that climate change is impacting all of us, and will even be more impacting all of us, and will impact all dimensions of sustainable development of our human system and the natural environment. Here at the OECD, we say climate change and addressing climate change and promoting sustainable development is basically one agenda. There will be no sustainable development without addressing climate change, both at the mitigation and adaptation front. So what we need to do is to manage the rising climate risk and stopping the climate crisis. We obviously must strengthen and accelerate our action to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to and cope with the impact of climate change. And we need to do so at every scale, from global, regional, national, and subnational to community levels. So this will be part of the agenda that we would like to address today. We're going to discuss the so-called vertical integration across these different scales of governance to promote climate change adaptation. And we will also refer to as a multi-level governance for adaptation. And at the same time, any adaptation action, whether it is initiated by domestic actors or development cooperation partners, must be inclusive to make sure that the action is informed by the needs of most vulnerable people on the ground. So, for example, the women, marginalized communities, indigenous groups, they all face quite often huge barriers for participating in decision-making processes or assessing resources, information, and technical solutions. So these are the two dimensions that we would like to address together with you. And so we want to explore how vertical collaboration and integration for adaptation across various scales can help national level adaptation policies, reflect the local realities, harness context-specific information about local climate risk, and empower local actors to plan and implement their actions towards climate resilience development in collaboration with domestic and international partners. To explore these topics, we have got very experienced panelists and a moderator from IISD with us today, who will share their insights into the vertical collaboration for promoting effective and far-reaching climate adaptation. But before we have the panel discussion, we have two quick presentations by dear colleagues here from the OECD and IISD to set the scene. So, as you may know, we published the OECD guidance for strengthening climate resilience just a couple of months ago. And what we developed, we have had very, very extremely helpful feedback and close collaboration with IISD colleagues. And we're really fascinated by the exchange with them. So as you will see, the IISD will also be launching in this webinar a brief that describes efforts of governments in advancing vertical integration, as well as lessons learned from these processes. So I'm really delighted to have this collaborative webinar happen today. So let me now come to the scene setting presentations. It's my great pleasure to introduce Taka Kato with us, who has been leading this work on climate resilience guidance and associated projects. And he will make a short presentation based on the components of the guidance, which are relevant to vertical integration and multi-level collaboration for promoting climate adaptation in developing countries. And with that, over to you, Taka, please.
Thanks very much, Haye. Can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, thanks very much, everyone, also from my end for joining this webinar. My name is Taka Kato, and my brief presentation today aims to outline a few points about multi-level collaboration and vertical integration to promote our efforts for climate adaptation and climate resilience. So I will try to focus mainly on two questions. The first one is, why does vertical integration matter to strengthening climate resilience and promoting adaptation? And the second one is, what can governments and donors do to foster the vertical integration? The first question, why does vertical integration matter to building climate resilience? So most of us already well aware that good adaptation needs a good understanding of climate change impacts on local livelihoods and their development, as well as the local ecosystems. So this sounds quite obvious, but I wanted to put this point as the start of my presentation, so that the better we understand the locally specific climate risks, the more likely we can plan and implement adaptation action effectively at the national and the local levels. So number two, we've also seen lots of evidence from developing countries and developed countries as well, suggesting that the locally planned action for climate resilience tend to address local specificity in climate risks more effectively than the top-down approaches can do in many cases. But at the same time, local level actors often face severe financial, technical, and human resource constraints to plan and implement such locally led actions. So vertical integration should aim to help address those resource and capacity constraints and empower local action for promoting adaptation action on the ground. And then locally led action should also be connected to national level actions. This is important for making sure that local realities are reflected in the national level strategic planning, especially the national adaptation plans and also other sectoral development policies, which with a focus on adaptation and climate resilience. Relating to that, in many cases, this top-down and bottom-up interactions also complements horizontal coordination across sectors and stakeholders, including with the private sector, civil society, and academia. So then my second question be like, what can governments and donors or development cooperation providers do to foster such vertical integration? Although there must be lots of other action points, but let me highlight a few points. The first one is that we should facilitate dialogue among actors across different levels of governance. Those dialogues should aim to make national and local adaptation policies complementary and mutually reinforcing. Relating to that point, we should also aim to enhance the two-way interaction between locally led management, locally led actions and national level processes, such as strategic planning, budgetary processing, and other public financial management aspects, and also implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And another point from me is about information. We can develop knowledge management systems to draw on both the bottom-up local knowledge about the livelihoods of the communities and their experience in coping with past natural disasters, and top-down scientific and statistical data and information about climate risks. And next point is about the institutional arrangement, which is that there are often local institutional arrangements that are already functioning well, that also can potentially work for resilience building as well. So we can build on and adjust and expand those good arrangements to mainstream climate resilience considerations. And linked to this point, there are also often government initiatives in decentralization already going on. So we can also building on those initiatives for such mainstreaming. Now, obviously, as many of you may have already noticed, my point has been mainly focused on the governance aspects, but the vertical collaboration itself is much broader than the governance aspects. We need other aspects like finance, sector level policy development, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, data and information capacity building, and technologies. These are all relevant to vertical integration for fostering the adaptation action that is country-owned, socially inclusive, and environmentally sustainable. And as Haye mentioned earlier, we published the guidance for government and development partners for strengthening climate resilience. And in that guidance, we have highlighted these elements of adaptation action. And I will share the link for the guidance later. But with that point, I want to stop and thank you very much once again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Taka, for this quick overview. And now I would like to invite Daniel Morshan to make his presentation. Daniel is the policy advisor with IISD's resident program. He's also leading work in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as on vertical integration for IISD. And with that, over to you, Daniel, please.
Thank you very much, Haye. So I have the opportunity to share with you now a second scene setting, and really I will be complementing a lot what Taka has said today. So we go to the next slide, please. So today we'd like to launch a report, as Haye said. This report assesses the progress and the challenges encountered by a variety of actors. This includes mostly government bodies, but also civil society organizations and communities. So how do they figure out to undertake climate adaptation action in a better way? That's what we're looking at. A way that is more representative and inclusive of local realities, but also in a way that institutions at national, local, and even supranational levels can work better together, and where policies are better fit for purpose, so better aligned to contribute to what just and effective adaptation should be. That's the essence of what we have tried to capture. Next slide, please. Let me start with a quick description of vertical integration in the context of adaptation. The NAP process, as you can imagine, there we are. The NAP process, as you can imagine, has a typical cycle. We have planning and design phase, with consultations and engagement, implementation phase, and the M&E element, the monitoring and evaluation element. What I want to focus on now, though, is the 4 enabling factors of vertical integration in a NAP process, the inner circle in the figure. Let me start by offering a definition, though. Vertical integration is the process of creating intentional and strategic, the 2 important elements there, intentional and strategic linkages between national and subnational adaptation, planning, implementation, and M&E. For these linkages to happen smoothly, we need funds to start with, that's for sure. But importantly, in looking at the first element there, the orange one, importantly, we also need financing mechanisms in place that enable funds to reach the local levels. We need institutional arrangements that promote interaction and dialogue across scales. We need to enable the possibility and easiness of information sharing, and there must be capacity strengthening programs for actors at all levels. Go to the next one, please. So those 4 enabling factors are needed to set up and run, let's say, a good vertical integration process. In turn, a sound vertical integration structure generates benefits and helps promote principles that are very dear and very close to the hearts of people like us sitting around the table, I think. People who care about sustainable development, about just, inclusive, and effective climate action. So vertical integration can help, 1, promote decentralization and participation. It can facilitate a more balanced sharing of power and be more welcoming of a broad range of knowledge sources that inform adaptation actions. And it can advance gender equality and gender responsiveness in adaptation planning and implementation. It can do so by shifting decision-making power from central to subnational authorities. We delve into these things in the report, so I'll invite you very much to go into that, hopefully afterwards, if we've captured your interest. Next one, please. But for now, we'll just, as these are brief presentations, just jump into the recommendations of the report. Number 1, establish a functioning local institutions with strong mandates. This means local institutions and an enabling environment for them to thrive in and grow in maturity and in influence. If you have well-resourced, well-staffed local governments, as well as strong civil society organizations and research institutes operating at a subnational level, then their say in adaptation debates becomes stronger, more meaningful, and ideally more influential. That would imply that the benefit that national governments and sectors will derive from them also increases. It makes these local institutions, both state and non-state actor institutions, a more attractive player, in broad terms. To get there, a strong focus on capacity development is also important. Local institutions need resources, influence, and mandates to truly grow. A seat at the table, but no vote, no mandate, is not the role that these institutions should be playing. And taking that approach, meaning not giving mandates and not giving real resources and influence, might backfire as an act of political positioning without real substance. I think it's important for me to keep that in mind. Number 2, build the puzzle of adaptation by including in it a multitude of perspectives. We know that piecemeal approaches and scattered adaptation projects, projectization, doesn't really add up to a whole lot or to a whole package of, of meaningful measures. Yet we continue to do this. What we need, and this is one of the things we learned from our study, is a fastidious approach to engaging subnational actors in national processes like the NAP, like National Adaptation Planning Process, and vice versa. That's the way to achieve a unified vision, or rather many visions that sit comfortably with one another, and use that puzzle as a basis for moving forward on adaptation. Next one, please. Number 3, set up diverse partnerships that ease access to adaptation knowledge. Research is key to understand local issues, and I'm referring to a very modern understanding of research, one that is transdisciplinary, collaborative, all of that. That kind of research is key to understanding the flaws in the system of climate governance that need addressing. It has become pretty clear that the Global South institutions need to play a powerful role, a role of equals in these partnerships, in order for adaptation efforts, both in the context of research, but also in relation to collaborations between government and CSOs and citizens, to be genuine, constructive, and to lead to something that starts to look like just adaptation. Number 4, finally, knowledge brokers can help bridge national and local visions of adaptation. Looking still at this important part of knowledge, it is really important to emphasize that in order to advance the goal of effective just adaptation, the existing hierarchy of knowledge needs to be re-examined so that a NAP, or a country's adaptation strategy, is really one that a vast group of stakeholders can feel represented in, through their knowledge being, they feel that it's part of what has shaped the final outcome. Yeah. So knowledge brokers are especially well suited to facilitate this type of collaboration, which tends to be a long process and very resource intensive. So I would like to leave you with that, but if we move to the next slide, before I pass it on back to Haji, I just want to acknowledge the number of people who participated in this report. These are the people listed there on the left. They are not actually the ones in the photo. We did all of this during the pandemic, but thank you so much for your inputs. It was invaluable, and without it, this report would not have come to be. And finally, for the last report, or for the last slide, sorry, just to thank you all very much for your attention, for being here today. And I will make sure that everyone receives also the link to this report, which is out now. Thank you so much, and back to you, Haji.
Thank you so much, Daniel. A nice picture of people, obviously. And just to say that here in Paris, we're moving back also into the offices. It's just so super cool to meet colleagues again. And obviously, we're all looking forward to receive colleagues also from across the world here at our premises at the OECD. Now, with that, talking about people, I think it's a super cool segue into our panel discussion. It will be moderated by our IISD colleague, Anne Hamil, in a sec. She's the Senior Director for Resilience at the IISD. She's been working on adaptation and resilience for many, many years, and obviously will show this kind of in-depth knowledge in a minute at the panel discussions. We're really great to have you as moderator, Anne. In the panel, we have Anchi Boasiako-Amo. He is the Deputy Director for Climate Vulnerabilities and Adaptation at the Environmental Protection Agency of Ghana. He is a lead member of the NDC implementation plan, and he has been coordinating also the preparation of the country's national adaptation plan. And he has been collaborating with the OECD on our study on coherence between adaptation and disaster risk mitigation. Second, we have Ximena Apis-Degree. She has been working as National Adaptation Plan Coordinator in the Climate Change Department of her government, of the Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica. With her, Ximena, and the colleagues, the IISD has developed a platform that helps decision makers and other stakeholders visualize climate impacts at local levels. Third, we have Patrick Siva. He is a Senior Policy Advisor at the Global Program on Climate Change and Environment at SDC, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. He has been a principal advisor for climate change adaptation for quite a while, and he also represented Switzerland, the board of the Adaptation Fund for a number of years. And just to say that SCC is a close, is not only member, but obviously Switzerland, but also as a very, very supportive collaborator on our work here in the OECD on adaptation. Andrea Rodriguez, she's a regional manager for Climate Action Program in the Fundación Avivna. She's an international lawyer, an expert in financial mechanisms to support adaptation and mitigation measures in developing countries. And Andrea and the IISD have been collaborating on a project on climate change adaptation and future on water security in the Andes, supported by SCC. Last but not least, we have Pushendra Satyai. He is a global forest policy coordinator for the Science Policy and Information Unit division of BirdLife International. And he has been working on a number of research programs on environment and development issues, particularly on government governance in Asia and Africa. Great panel. And with that, over to you, Anne, please.
Great, thank you so much for making those introductions, Hajan. Really want to thank our colleagues and friends over at the OECD for working with us on this webinar and trying to unpack, I think, some of these really important themes and ideas around vertical integration. I think this is something that we all agree is critical to effective adaptation action, and we're just really trying to understand what that actually means in practice. And so this panel discussion is a fantastic opportunity. We've got some wonderful colleagues joining us with different perspectives. We've got government perspective, civil society, research, and then of course a bilateral cooperation perspective as well that can help us understand, again, what it actually means to advance vertical integration for more effective adaptation action. And so the way that we're gonna structure this discussion is really, we're gonna start with sort of an opening question for all of our panelists. And ask them the same question to sort of to give us a flavor for what kind of experience that they really want to sort of point to in this discussion. And then I'll have a set of specific questions for each of our panelists to sort of further unpack that experience, and then we'll bring it all together at the end. And then, of course, we will leave it open to any questions from audience members that they may have for our panelists and to add to this discussion. And so the first question I have is obviously to our panelists, is that we've asked you to join us in this conversation because you obviously have your own experiences in trying to make these deliberate and strategic links between different levels of decision making and governance in your respective countries and regions to advance adaptation action. And so the question, I guess, is to share with us through a real world example, if you will, what you think is, if you could identify the one crucial factor that you think enabled a successful experience with vertical integration. And with that, maybe we can start with Antwi.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Anne, for the question, and then also thanks for being a moderator for this very important section. I think talking about something that is very dear to my heart as somebody who has been on the field personally, working from the background of climate change adaptation, I think at a country level, there is, before I come to my personal experience quickly, I think I work within a framework which has been made possible for all these experiences to be guarded. And that is the fact that the national systems actually advances decentralization, which actually provides a system where local governance is one of the key tenets of democracy in the country. On top of this is a national development planning system that looks at vertical integration as one of the critical conditions that one has to deal with. And so the National Development Planning Commission actually coordinates both horizontal and then also vertical related activities. Then again, there's a medium-term development plan by the country which admits or which provides a very suitable enabling environment for climate change adaptation to be addressed across all levels. And so this makes provision for advancing climate change adaptation issues at the local level. And that's a very fantastic national framework that one can actually work with. And to make this happen is the National Climate Change Policy supported by the adaptation planning processes, of which the national vision within the adaptation planning framework is to promote vertical integration and horizontal integration. So it's a national vision that is spelled out clearly within the national adaptation planning framework. And so I have been working in this framework for some years, trying to advance these critical issues at the subnational level with partners, basically working with district assemblies who already have what they call district medium-term development plans. These medium-term development plans actually, among other things, address environment and climate change related issues as part of driving development at the local level. And this had been the focus of my work by building capacity, by driving institutional coordination, and then by also making sure that communication of climate change adaptation is clearly articulated at the subnational level. And so this probably starts the whole scene. And then once the opportunity comes again, I'll be able to advance this discussion in my next question. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, Antwi. And that really speaks to then what I'm hearing is that just a really strong institutional framework and commitment that just sets the scene for effective vertical integration to take place. So that's really great. How about you, Jimena? What's the sort of, what would you say is a one crucial factor through an example in vertical integration from your perspective?
Gracias. Sí, escuchando a los colegas en las presentaciones anteriores, realmente este tema que señalaron de los two-way interactions, ¿verdad? Las interacciones en ambas líneas, realmente es algo que hemos visto que puede llevar a procesos mucho más ricos a nivel de intercambio de experiencias y recopilación de información. En el caso de Costa Rica, estamos trabajando en planificación de la adaptación en 3 diferentes niveles. Estamos trabajando desde el año pasado en lo que es el ámbito regional, en las 6 regiones socioeconómicas del país. El país cuenta con planes regionales de desarrollo, entonces hemos estado trabajando en identificación de acciones de adaptación prioritarias que puedan ser transversalizadas en la futura actualización de los planes regionales de desarrollo del país. Este es un proceso que se ha hecho con participación de actores regionales en cada una de las regiones del país y ha sido muy rico ver cómo los insumos que se están compilando desde el ámbito regional pueden realmente ser de utilidad, por un lado, para el NAP, entonces de abajo para arriba, para poder tener esas voces regionales en el momento en que construimos un plan nacional de adaptación. Típicamente en otros procesos se han realizado planes nacionales con un enfoque un poco más sectorial, pero no regional, y estamos viendo que esa interacción entre el ámbito regional y el nacional para la construcción del NAP está dando insumos sumamente valiosos. Y después, por otro lado, la interacción también entre el ámbito regional al ámbito local, a nivel de lo que son los gobiernos locales y las municipalidades, también hemos visto que ha sido de gran utilidad. En el marco de Costa Rica estamos trabajando en acompañar a 20 cantones piloto en lo que es también la identificación de acciones de adaptación prioritarias a nivel local, a nivel de los cantones del país, y poder integrar estas acciones en los planes locales de desarrollo. Y para esos procesos también el poder aprovechar el ámbito regional y las acciones que ya se han identificado prioritarias a nivel de las regiones, por ejemplo a nivel de cuenca, enfoques a nivel de cuencas en donde varios cantones tendrían que articular. Es un marco orientador que ha sido muy útil para los cantones que están iniciando sus procesos de planificación. Entonces, realmente el facilitar el diálogo y como Ministerio de Ambiente, el poder estar presentes, apoyando en los procesos de articulación en estos 3 niveles, nos ha permitido recopilar insumos que de un proceso funcionen y sean de valor para el otro y viceversa. Entonces, eso sí sería algo que los colegas señalaron que también nosotros hemos considerado como realmente importante para todos los distintos procesos. Muchas gracias.
Great, thanks. So a great example of facilitating action at the local level as well. So thank you for that. What about you, Patrick? From a bilateral, what's been sort of the one critical factor for you that you've seen that enables vertical integration to take place?
Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to share a few thoughts and on behalf of a bilateral donor and the perspective in this distinguished panel. I would say SDC really is a donor that is dedicated to fostering vertical integration and making better use of multi-level governance process for climate change adaptation. If I focus a bit on my real world vertical integration story, that will take us to Latin America and more precisely to SDC's adaptation work in the Andes. We have actually been active in this thematic field for a number of years already. But our focus therein has slightly shifted over the years. And I would like to show how reconsiderations of what our role as development agency can be has also shaped and led us towards putting more weight on vertical integration aspects. So this shift has been closely linked to reforms in our institution that have also taken place. To start with, I mean, we go to Peru. Peru used to be a so-called priority country of Swiss development cooperation. We had a full-fledged bilateral program being implemented there. And after almost 50 years of collaboration, the modality has changed to a certain degree. And the cooperation now takes place under a thematically focused unit that deals with global challenges, and specifically in this region with global challenges related to water, climate change, and environment. And under this structure, the operational activities, somehow the implementation of operational activities is more perceived as a mean to an end, and it is providing the substance for the aspect of policy dialogues and shaping forward-looking policies together with our partners, which has become much more important. So also from our institution's point of view, it became a clear request that our activities are being implemented according to a so-called elevator approach, which tries to link different levels. And here we're talking about the subnational level, national level, then also the regional and the global levels, with the idea of actually operational work being implemented locally that creates the evidence that can be at the level of policies, of innovation, or also of knowledge, and then ensuring a certain replication and sharing at national or also regional levels. And all of this with the intention to also then influence global policies and platforms. So what does that mean in concrete terms in this region? I think I would like to distinguish 3 different levels and 3 different timeframes. And I think it nicely links also to what has been presented in the introduction already. So we had a long-standing local program that dealt with assessing the impacts of climate change in a specific upland region in Peru at the provincial level. I think that was very important at the level of creating the credibility or a solid basis on which to then further expand. And then we had this request, which last but not least also came internally, to expanding the program to better link to national processes and to feed the experiences, both in terms of content and methodological experiences, how to go about with bottom-up adaptation planning into these ongoing processes so that they could be taken up and replicated elsewhere. So that was actually the moment to contribute to national processes, be it a NAP process or also NDCs. And then as a third phase, somehow banking on the experiences gained and providing a platform spaces to share this experience with other countries, with other regions, with the intention to inspire and allow mutual learning. And in all of this, we have seen our role as being that of a convener that can provide, let's say, the spaces where such elements can be discussed. That all sounds as if this could all be planned and implemented accordingly, but I think it's fair to say that also, of course, a lot depended on a fair share of fortunate coincidences that somehow make this happen. Thank you very much, and over to you again.
Great, thank you so much, Patrick. And it's interesting that you've got this sort of very deliberate approach, this elevator approach that you just talked about in your programming and in your partnership. How about you, Andrea? From more of a civil society perspective, what's been your experience in terms of identifying the one crucial factor?
Excellent. Thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here in this panel and to share with you a little bit of our experience from Fundación Avina. For those of us who don't know us, Fundación Avina is a Latin American foundation that seeks to promote systematic changes through collaborative processes. And we work at the global, regional, national, and local level. And for us to make vertical integration work, we believe that it's essential to ensure the participation and engagement of different stakeholders. And some of the examples that I want to share with you today are related to how we're trying to integrate and support the work of local governments in the implementation of adaptation planning processes, basically in different countries in Latin America. And just to give you an example, we're currently supporting the government of Peru in an adaptation planning processes in which the government is trying to implement their adaptation commitments stated in their NDCs in 5 key sectors, but with the participation of local governments. And in order to do that, it's quite important to assess
the local capacities in terms of what are the existing policy instruments, what are the enabling conditions that are needed to translate and mainstream adaptation national needs into local actions, and do them the other way around as well. So national policy can be fed with elements from the local perspective. And we know that if we truly want to implement adaptation commitments, it's crucial to integrate the participation of local governments. Another example that we have is a regional program that we're actually implementing, which is called Andes Resilientes, or Resilient Andes, operating in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And this program seeks to enhance the resilience of vulnerable people living in rural areas in the Andean region of these countries. But in order to be able to achieve that goal, the program is looking to support government action, so through enhancing institutional capacities, collaboration through and across different sectors in order to be able to respond to the needs of local communities. And thirdly, we're also developing a couple of adaptation projects that will be submitted to the Green Climate Fund for funding consideration. One is in Mexico and another one is in Brazil. And these projects, in a general manner, try to enhance the resilience of vulnerable people to climate change impacts. But our approach is to ensure that the solution that we try to bring comes from the local communities, the people who will be affected by the problem, but ensuring that these solutions are integrated into local public policies. So the articulation with local governments and the national government become crucial to ensure that solutions are sustainable long-term.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. So hearing lots of some great examples again of like the different frameworks and the approaches that are being taken and actual experiences. And just to sort of round this out with these sort of, asking for the one crucial factor or experience that you want to speak to, maybe I can hand it over to you, Prashandra, if there's, what you would identify as being absolutely critical.
Yeah, thank you very much. So to answer that question, I'll just relate to some of the research I have done and then what I have found. So one of the aspects I was always interested was the role of collaboration and coordination across different scales in terms of research, policy, and practice. So we researched the impacts of decentralization in terms of, obviously, there are parallels with vertical integration and decentralization as well. Decentralization has been in many countries for a number of years. And there is transfer of power, authority, resources, and so on to the lower level of governance. So we wanted to check what are the lessons we can learn in terms of decentralization to vertical integration. So one aspect we focused was in terms of how the two aspects like participation and flexible governance or adaptive governance. So how these two central components of climate adaptation whether this has been undermined or enhanced by the process of decentralization. So we found three key factors. One is the need to ensure, like I think many of the panelists members have already raised the issue that we need to ensure equitable representation from mainly the marginalized groups and social groups, drawing both from the formal and informal participation structures and processes. That is one of the lessons that vertical integration in climate adaptation can take. The other is the importance of assessing and addressing capacity deficits, because particularly at the subnational and local scales of governance, we found that capacity deficit is one of the hindrances that also hinders flexibility in governance. So that is another factor, another component we found. And third is the ability of using different kinds of governance structures, like the hybrid structures as well, not only government formal structures, but also other kinds of like informal structures as well, and local actors and other intermediaries of different kinds. I think Daniel previously said about the role of the knowledge brokers. So I would highlight that these intermediaries who are rooted in the very local level, but they also have the ability to cross across different scales of governance. So we found that's quite crucial. So I continue to research also on the related aspect of climate adaptation governance. So one of the aspects was how multidimensional injustices and structural inequity impact indigenous adaptation. What are the factors? And I think Daniel again mentioned that there are, this aspect of projectization. So whatever we found that at the very local level, the support and the adaptation related projects are mainly focused on one particular aspects of justice, like distribution of material benefits, just provision of housing or handouts. But less attention is paid to the procedural aspect of justice, like uneven participation, political discrimination. So we argue that this is a very depoliticized and fragmented approach to justice, suggests a very slow and incomplete way of operationalizing justice because it omits other important aspects, procedural justice, aspect of recognition and identity, capability issues, and so on. So in terms of addressing this kind of, obviously I'm talking about the research, but also how that research insights can be used for policy and practice. We have also looked into how aspects of ethics and justice have been used in adaptation literature. And what we found that in most of the studies, they focus in only one scale, such as the local level, sometimes not necessarily linking that to the national and sub-national drivers of injustice. And at the international scale of analysis as well, most of the issues on justice and ethics remain very philosophical in nature. So, without lacking specific details and then mechanism to operationalize in the national or local context. So we have tried to come up with a framework that can integrate ethics and justice right in the kind of upstream in terms of the adaptation and resilience planning, as well as that can be used in the downstream in the implementation as well. So then I think most importantly, I think it is important to pay specific attention to the need of the vulnerable groups and communities and address justice issues arising from unequal access to goods, resources, services, and opportunities, and also institutions. So I'm saying that from my academic hat, but at the moment, I now work with the BirdLife International's policy team, where I also see myself having a mediating role and also taking this global to local approach in policy, advocacy, and conservation actions across our partnership in 115 countries. And this switch from the academic to more civil society and practitioner role, I see as a kind of interesting twist to my own personal vertical integration story as well. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So some really great, some great themes there about, like you were saying, I think the ethics and justice piece of adaptation tends to be very localized, like you say, and it doesn't necessarily feed up into national conversations and processes. And so, yeah, so how do we set up vertical integration processes that allow for that sort of some bottom up experience and conversations to feed national priorities and decisions. So thanks for all of that. And I feel like, this next set of questions for the speakers then really gets to, again, something you flagged, Prashendra, and this is actual capacities for making vertical integration happen. So I think we've heard a lot about frameworks and approaches that have been taken, some observations and some experiences, which have been really rich. But if we actually want to sort of dig a bit deeper and talk about actual capacities, I guess my first question would be to you, Andrea, from the sort of the accessing climate funds perspective, recognizing that Avina, Fundación Avina plays an important role in this. So we know that accessing funds for adaptation is a big challenge for developing countries, especially
I think we've lost Anne for a moment. Hopefully she'll be back soon. But Anne, if you can hear us, we cannot hear you. Okay, I think you're back, Anne.
Okay, I'm going to try to be very quick. So Andrea, my question was to you. we know that accessing funds for adaptation is a real challenge, but in addition to accessing funds, it's also making sure that they're aligned with local needs and priorities. So given your experience, what do you think, what are the specific capacities that are needed to enable this alignment and ensure that funds for adaptation address local concerns and priorities?
Thank you for the question, Anne. And it's true, I think it's a big challenge indeed to mobilize resources for adaptation results, and particularly with the participation of local stakeholders. I think it's important to analyze the case from the beneficiary perspective and also from the funds perspective. When it comes to the beneficiary perspective, I think we all know that often local communities and local governments, they're the ones that know best what the problems are and what the solutions are to those problems. But I would say many times the issue is that those problems are not translated into a project proposal, so to say. So it's very important to have understanding on what the problem is, what the solution is, or what is trying to be offered to address that particular problem, and how can that problem be translated into a project proposal. The other element that is quite important is to understand the fund that you're trying to seek support from. Each, and I'm talking about the global funds available, each of these funds have their own governance rules, they have their own requirements, and it's very important to familiarize with what is the type of support that they seek to provide, to make sure that the project proposals are aligned to those funds needs. So having the capacities in place to formulate project proposals and to translate those needs into project proposals would be fundamental. And from the funds perspectives, I think we all know that globally, most of the resources are going to support mitigation responses and mitigation actions. And often it's hard to increase the support towards adaptation solutions. So I think it would be very important for many global institutions to prioritize adaptation actions. And in the ways how they could do that would be to provide technical support for the design of project proposals, because it's always hard, I would say, to deal with elements of development and climate change if you are trying to submit a proposal to an adaptation fund. So many global institutions can deploy resources, technical resources, to guide the development of such proposals. And that way, proposals on adaptation could increase long-term. I think the other element would be to continue provide resources, technical and financial, to continue increasing capacities, institutional capacities, enabling conditions that are needed to understand the local needs, to translate them into solutions, and to also to set the environment so adaptation proposals can be implemented effectively. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And apologies to everybody. I've had to turn off my camera. I hear that my internet is patchy, so I will try to be very quick with my questions and make sure it's clear. Antwi, my next question actually is to you. We know that communicating the priorities of local level actors to the national government is absolutely fundamental to making climate adaptation action work. And so, you've described the framework in your context and the important role of decentralization and then the policy framework. What would you say, though, is that a key skill that local actors must have, whether they be government or non-governmental, in order to make this link happen from the local to the national? And so I'll start with a key skill at the local level, and then if you have any reflections on a key skill at the sort of a national decision-making level, that would be welcome as well. But some key skills to really make these links happen.
Thank you so much once again, Anne, for the opportunity. This is a very crucial question because working with the district level actors, I think there are some key skills that are very critical for this vertical integration to sustainably happen at the local level. One of the key skills that is needed, that is very critical, is the skill to be able to comprehend the nexus between climate change and development. I think at the basic level, the key institution that coordinates local climate change activities is the district assemblies. It can be the municipal assembly or it can be the metropolitan, but let's take it from the minutest level, which is the district. It is very important for the planning officers and then the key actors on the ground to be able to understand the difference between climate and the normal development, because climate change comes as an additionality to the normal development framework. This is something that it doesn't come common, and so one has to be very careful and has to be trained to be able to understand what kind of additionality that climate change presents to the normal development discourse. This is very important because maybe constructing a drainage system under normal circumstance without climate change comes with maybe normal design, but then how do you as a developer at that basic level be able to actually add on with the level of or the volume of rainwater that is going to be on the surface, and how do you actually factor this into your planning at that level? So you need to be able to understand what is normal development and then what is climate change resilience building. That's the first thing that one has to be able to know. The second thing is the skill at that level to be able to develop bankable projects at that level. You know, climate change adaptation project development is as complex as anything that one can talk about. Unlike mitigation, that is very straightforward to be able to calculate how many tons of CO2 or maybe methane that one is adding into the atmosphere, and then how can this be abated or mitigated and put in a cost or something of that nature. It doesn't come the same way with adaptation and resilience building. And so it's important that actors at that level get a very comprehensive understanding, training with how to develop bankable projects. In our context, for instance, there aren't much dedicated funding locally or domestically to be able to address some of these issues. Some of them come as part of sectoral development activities and budgets, but then there isn't at the moment a dedicated local funding addressing climate change issues at that level. And so it's important that actors at that level be able to get the skill needed to be able to develop bankable projects. And talking about this, it has to be something that is systemic and then also sustainable. Giving an example, for instance, currently there is an EU project or program that is called Green Project. And in that, there's a facility called LOCAR, which is very systemic, trying to use climate multi-level or multinational climate money to be able to address local issues in terms of capacity and then also in terms of doing vulnerability assessment at that level. Thus, the districts have to actually justify why they can be able to assess this kind of facility. The local is very systemic and it's also scalable. It has been in the system for some time. We need some kind of more of these kind of interventions to be able to address climate needs at that level. The next skill that is needed is communicating what has been achieved, because you need to make a good case for somebody to be able to buy in, because there should be a baseline. Most of these local actors are doing a number of things that they are not even aware of the magnitude of the impact that they are creating. How can somebody be able to mobilize all this and communicate it effectively so that be it local donors or international donors will be able to buy into this very important baseline achievement at the local level to be able to upscale on this. So communicating what has been achieved so far is very important. And at this moment, I think this is something that is also lacking. Connected to that is be able to actually also translate what is being done into languages that people can be able to appreciate. I am not a fan of maybe trying to develop language to language, what do you call, guidelines for this local integration, because most of the people that are supposed to be served hardly can even read. But then if the one communicating could be able to speak the language that these actors can also understand and be able to act, it makes more meaningful, it makes more impactful than maybe developing languages, documents that the actors themselves cannot be able to read and understand. So yes, local languages are very critical, very important. It has to be something that can easily be communicated and be understood and be useful for the activities that are happening at the local level. And so there are key skills that are needed at that local level. And for government, quickly, I just want to also add on the side of government, a very good skill to be able to coordinate the institutions that matter so that no one is left behind in terms of the actors and then in terms of the institutions that are critical at this level. I think I'll stop here for the others to also take the floor. Back to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Antwi. There was a lot in there from sort of just a really solid understanding of what changes will come with climate change and developing bankable projects so that local actors can submit ideas and participate in bigger programs and initiatives that are happening maybe at the national level. And then the key role of communication in a number of ways. Those really jumped out at me and I think make a lot of sense. And then, yeah, I think, there's no question that adaptation, especially vertical integration for adaptation, requires massive coordination and making sure that capacity exists, especially at the national level, but I'd say at all levels is critical. So thank you for that. Pashendra, I wanted to ask you about, sort of this, you spoke about some of the research and policy and practice gaps and some of the work that you've done in the past. And so, if, for example, if you've just finished a long meeting with government officials and want to get them on board with the research and building the bridges between some of the research and the policy practice and recognizing that this is important for vertical integration, what do you see as priority actions for making, enhancing the role and addressing this research policy gap for vertical integration? I'm not sure if that makes sense. Pashendra, let me know if that question makes sense to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very important question, actually. Yeah, so to start with, I think it is first critical to have a better engagement, re-engagement between those who want to understand the world, like researchers and academics, and who want to, who can change the world, like the practitioners, policymakers, activists. So I would say that it is imperative on behalf of the scientific communities, researchers, to engage more actively right from the beginning of a research process with the policymakers, practitioners, and non-state actors of different kinds, so that this help in enriching policy and practice with the evidence-based research. And at the same time, also, it can enrich the research itself, because you can collect the institutional memories and knowledge of the variety of actors like policymakers, practitioners, and other groups. So I think while working collaboratively in the interface of this science, policy, and practice, it is also important to recognize that the policy of innovation and transformational change that is needed for adaptation governance aspects lie not only in the continuation of what our institutional pathways or boundaries suggest, but the way multiple actors and institutions interact and find a kind of common solution. So obviously, there are also, in that sense, I think we need to find about what are the barriers to such kind of collaborations. So sometimes in many countries I have worked, like particularly in Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and then Nepal, India. What I've seen in some of the countries is there's sometimes they have antagonistic relations between the government and civil society. So in that sense, I think we need to find an entry point to develop some more trust and enhance communication. That was also highlighted some members of the panelists before as well. And I would also like to stress again, sometimes it is useful to identify early in the research process, in the kind of implementation phase of certain projects and programs as well, to identify different types of the intermediaries. So this can be sometimes school teachers, sometimes NGO workers, sometimes indigenous leaders, or sometimes the government, member of the staff government as well. So, and as I also highlighted before, there are, sometimes these intermediaries are knowledge brokers, or sometimes we call the champions as well. They are rooted to the local level, but they have the ability to cross across skills, different skills. So sometimes they can cross not only kind of vertical, but across different sectors, horizontal and probably diagonally as well, because sometimes that might be possible as well. I mean, we have worked in some of the countries, and we have looked into the importance of these intermediaries of different kinds. And they also know the concerns, priorities, and modalities of working between the policymakers and practitioners, as well as academics as well. So that would be quite useful. And I think, and we also highlighted about finding a common language. Sometimes it is useful to find a common language to generate engagement on certain topics that get traction in the research agenda. I'm talking again on behalf of the researchers. So for example, when we were working in arid and semi-arid regions of Asia and Africa, most of the conversation boiled down to water issues. So we rephrase our research question in terms of the water security lens. So sometimes in order to generate more discussion on the topic on climate, so we might have to do that as well. I think most importantly for all researchers, policymakers, practitioners, I would highlight again the importance of putting equity and justice at the core of our working, and ensure full and effective participation of mostly the marginalized groups, giving voice to them, so that we get to understand about their needs, priority, and concerns, and then address them through collective effort. And also, I think apart from the scientific knowledge, we also need to incorporate a bi-level local and indigenous knowledge systems of different kinds, like it can be citizen science, local wisdom, and I already highlighted about the institutional memories of the different actors, particularly the non-state actors at the different levels. Because possible adaptation pathways can be found by with the incorporation of these kind of context-specific knowledge system as well as the scientific knowledge, which also has the ability to reconnect between research, practice, and policy in different scales of governance. So in summary, I would like to again stress the importance of moving beyond our disciplinary boundaries, sectoral silos, and also beyond one scale to moving to multi-scalar, multi-sectoral, multi-actor, and interdisciplinary approach to link science, policy, and practice in all aspects of climate governance. So I leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And that's been really helpful, because I think oftentimes these vertical integration conversations do tend to be sort of very focused on sort of traditional government processes and conversations. And so being able to identify also how to better bring in, civil society and research perspectives. And in that, what I heard really was, not only just valuing different knowledges, but also, creating spaces for trust building and the role of intermediaries and brokers. And then again, this issue of communication is coming up over and over to really make sure that these different levels of decision-making and governance are speaking to each other effectively and strategically. So thank you for that. Jimena, I want to sort of end my round of questions, specific questions to panelists with you. And so in Costa Rica, you have identified that strengthening the capacities of subnational government officials is critical for making adaptation action more effective. And I think we've heard that from a number of panelists today. So what have you learned specifically through your process, and what lessons would you share with others in strengthening the capacity of subnational government officials in being able to advance vertical integration?
Gracias, Anne. Sí, yo creo que una de las lecciones importantes es empezar por poner atención al espacio que se está utilizando para hacer esos procesos de fortalecimiento de capacidades y de planificación, así como quiénes están involucrados en ese espacio y con qué lentes se está analizando el tema, con qué lentes se está haciendo ese fortalecimiento de capacidades y cómo se está comprendiendo el tema de adaptación al cambio climático. En el contexto nuestro, por ejemplo, era muy importante, nos parecía crucial que aprovecháramos espacios de coordinación ya existentes en las regiones. Entonces estábamos trabajando en el marco de unos comités regionales de desarrollo que existen en cada región con representación de diferentes instancias de gobierno. Sin embargo, veíamos también la necesidad de entonces preguntarnos, más allá de los actores de gobierno, quiénes también deberían estar involucrados en este espacio. Entonces, por un lado, el contemplar un espacio de articulación ya existente, consideramos que era importante porque ya hay discusiones importantes y un momentum que se genera en ese espacio que ya lleva rato de existir, que considerábamos era importante aprovechar en lugar de duplicar y crear una nueva estructura para realizar los procesos de planificación de la adaptación. También, volviendo al punto que Anthony mencionaba, ese espacio que ya existía era un espacio en donde se tocan temas de desarrollo, entonces considerábamos que también era un espacio que podía generar discusiones muy ricas sobre la integración y la transversalización del tema de adaptación con el tema de desarrollo, para que no se viera como una agenda separada. Entonces consideramos muy importante aprovechar ese espacio ya existente, pero también ser críticos y preguntarnos, ¿están ahí sentados todas las personas y los actores que consideramos deberían estar? Y al hacernos esas preguntas nos llevó a darnos cuenta que sí había una ausencia de representación de otros actores. Entonces fue más bien inclusive un buen espacio para ampliar la convocatoria a otros actores de sociedad civil, de sector privado, y de hacer ese fortalecimiento de capacidades en un espacio en donde más bien se fomentara el intercambio de vivencias y de experiencias de parte de los diferentes actores en torno al tema de cambio climático. Esto nos permitió que no solo fuera, por ejemplo, el Ministerio de Ambiente compartiendo o dando una perspectiva de los conceptos generales de adaptación, de cambio climático, de planificación de la adaptación, sino también que otras voces y otros actores, incluidos de sociedad civil, pudieran también ser parte de este intercambio y que pudiéramos nivelar conocimiento también escuchando esas diferentes voces y no solo presentando la perspectiva, por ejemplo, de los facilitadores desde el Ministerio de Ambiente. Entonces, yo sí diría que es una buena reflexión el preguntarse el espacio, quiénes están involucrados en ese espacio, qué voces se están escuchando en ese espacio de discusión. Y otra lección clave en ese proceso fue que si bien este era un proceso que estábamos haciendo desde el ámbito subnacional, para identificar acciones de adaptación prioritarias a nivel de las regiones. Al fin y al cabo hay que reconocer que en países como Costa Rica todavía la descentralización entre el ámbito regional y nacional en algunas ocasiones no es tan clara a nivel de poder de toma de decisión final. Entonces veíamos también que si bien en el espacio de planificación regional podían suceder procesos participativos muy ricos para identificar acciones de adaptación, al fin y al cabo normalmente va a haber algún proceso de discusión con entidades de gobierno central cuando ya estamos en un punto de llegar a compromisos y arreglos institucionales más concretos y de terminar de definir la ruta de acción. Entonces, si los actores también desde el ámbito nacional no están más sensibilizados y también cuentan con las capacidades para comprender el tema de adaptación, ahí hay un vacío que podría representar limitantes a nivel de los compromisos finales que se adquieran. Entonces, aunque se esté trabajando desde un ámbito subnacional, por esa relevancia que también tienen los actores nacionales en la toma de decisiones en algunas ocasiones finales, especialmente en instituciones que no estén tan descentralizadas, nos llevó a concluir que era muy importante también tener ese acercamiento con las entidades de gobierno central y asegurar también de que a nivel de cómo estábamos entendiendo el tema de adaptación, ellos también estuvieran capacitados al respecto. Muchas gracias.
Great, thanks for that. And so what I'm really hearing coming strongly is the importance of using existing processes, whether it's decentralization or planning processes, existing spaces or fora, like you just mentioned, Jimena, and existing conversations as well. And so there's a lot that we can already build into to really realize the opportunities and the potential of vertical integration. Patrick, I want to come to you and sort of with the donor perspective. So we, as you said in your opening remarks, this is sort of an approach and a priority for some of SDC's programming, particularly in Latin America. And so I guess the question is, part of what will emphasize the donor support for vertical integration is establishing long-term partnerships to make investments sustainable over the longer term. And so could you share with us some lessons from SDC's approaches that you'd alluded to earlier in terms of partnering with domestic actors at different levels to make SDC's development impacts long-lived?
Yes, thank you very much, and for this relevant question, and happy to somehow further elaborate on these elements. So I think it's fair to say that vertical integration really is a priority approach for the SDC. As I have shown, it has somehow grown out of this also reconsideration of what role can we actually play, what catalytic role can we actually play in all of this. And still, I think it's also fair to say that there's a number of preconditions that need to be there in order to be able to really put that to the forefront and really work at that level. And I will afterwards show a few elements or point to a few aspects that I consider to be relevant from our Latin American experience, but also having a look at where this vertical integration is also being fostered in other parts of the world, be it in South Asia or also in Africa. I think it's also interesting from an impact perspective for a donor agency like SDC, because with rather limited financial resources, I think this also allows, and I think there's a lot of signals that show that there's a need for more focus on these elements. So I think also from this perspective is further boosting, let's say, the taking into consideration these approaches and supporting such processes. Always understood in the way that what we can add or what we can support is really just catalytic. We need to somehow see that we can support elements that are already there. We also have to see that we do this in partnership. I mean, we're just together with others trying to support these elements. So we have to bring to the table the different instruments and the different tools that are available. And I think we have to really see how we can partner with others and make sure that the comparative advantages that everyone has are really brought forward and can support to such a complex process that we are actually talking about. And I think we heard a lot of different aspects on that. If I was looking a bit to what are elements, and not telling that we have performed very well on all of these, but what do I perceive as being very important, relevant in this aspect, is on the one hand, and I think they're closely linked, is a certain predictability. And I think also very important is a long-term perspective. And I think I already touched upon the point of the credibility, which is a third element that I think is a very important and key element for a more organic flow of ideas and finally success in vertical integration efforts. The predictability. So let's ask ourselves, why should a partner government want to actually embark on such a journey with a development agency? I think I think the word has already been mentioned several times, there's a need for a high level of mutual trust. And there's a need to be sure that that somehow the catalytic role of the development agency will last over a certain period and is also to a certain degree free of hidden agendas. So it's all about the credibility, and I think their prior long-standing cooperation is really a key element of somehow helping in this regard. And then the long-term perspective, I think vertical integration really requires time and major efforts. And I think I can look at how this is happening in our own countries. This takes a lot of time, and this will need a sustained longer-term engagement that is crucial for progress there to happen. Otherwise, it's difficult to somehow achieve anything. And then maybe the last element I want to focus on is also a certain flexibility. I think last but not least, if it does not harm at least to also have possibilities to adapt to changing framing conditions. I think the last few months have shown us this in another aspect, but I think it also comes true in somehow trying to support and contribute to such complex processes, as we heard, taking on board all the different, with many other actors, and taking on board all the different perceptions that are around. It requires a high level of flexibility. So these just a few elements that I think we have drawn a bit the lessons are key for a successful role of a development agency in contribution to these processes. Thank you very much, and over to you, Anne.
Great, thanks so much, Patrick, and that's really helpful. We have about 8 minutes left, so what we're going to do is actually go straight to some of the Q&A that we're seeing already from some participants on the line, which has been great. And hopefully we can sort of take a couple of those questions, and then I'll hand it back over to Haj to wrap up this great conversation. So I see a couple of questions here that are really related to this issue of communication that came up, I think, from a number of panelists about sort of, how do you talk about climate change in a way that really does tap into the local knowledge and experience, and making sure that that gets fed in properly into other, maybe national level conversations. And I don't know if any of the panelists have specific examples in, this issue of language and being able to talk about climate change needs and priorities at the local level, and making sure that that's sort of captured appropriately. Does anybody want to speak to that?
Yes, and I can start.
Sure.
Quickly. Yeah, so I think it's very important. I mentioned it, and then I think Prashandra also did mention how communication is very critical in advancing vertical integration. The key thing is to actually address the language barrier. And for Ghana, for instance, it's one of the major problems because we speak quite a number of languages. But then we've started at our level by trying to they have community information centers that we try to localize some of these issues through the community information centers. And I think the feedback is positive. We also try to use DEBA, where people come together in an assembly form where you can communicate, trying to break down the science, because climate change comes with a lot of technicalities. And so you have to have different platforms, sometimes imageries, trying to let them understand what critically is closer to them, by also even tapping into the indigenous knowledge that is available within that community. Sometimes science that's available within that community, a tree or a water system can be used to demonstrate climate change related issues. And so there are a variety of methods that can be used at that level, and one has to try them all. There's nothing like one size fits all in this context. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Maybe I could actually ask the next question to Patrick. I think there have been a number that have come towards the donor experience, and there's two things. So one, I saw a question was, how do you sort of address the fact that, the pressure that donors are often applying to demonstrating adaptation outcomes and not necessarily investing in some of the enabling environment aspects needed to make things like vertical integration happen. How have you dealt with that tension, or has SDC sort of confronted that tension? And then also this issue of fragmentation, and I think this came up with a number of panelists about how a fragmented adaptation landscape of different projects and initiatives can actually work against vertical integration and getting the different levels speaking and working together. Are those issues that you've confronted at all at SDC? And if so, how have you addressed them?
Well, thank you very much for these interesting questions. Maybe I start with the second one, the fragmentation part and the adaptation landscape that is made up of small piecemeal supports, let's say, that are being provided. And there, I think I refer to somehow this partnership aspect and the coordination aspect. So I think, yes, we are of course also not free of these pressures under which we are asked. I think this also refers to the other aspect of trying to deliver on somehow impacts, outcomes, rather than somehow having the time and the possibility to really work on the framing conditions that somehow will allow this to happen. I do not have a silver bullet solution to somehow present, but I think it needs this perception and illustration. And I think a lot is also about the communication part to somehow really illustrate the need to advance at that level as well. So, and I think what I can say is that as we have this possibility of actually this longer-term engagement and really getting involved. I mean, I've been mentioning this one project which really had a look at what is actually at stake, what is actually the implications. We were in a fortunate position to somehow provide substantial financing for that over many years to really understand the situation. This is of course not enough, but I think it's going into the right direction of having a solid basis on which to create. I think these are a few thoughts, but I'm sure that others have elements to complement. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I realize that we're running out of time, but I just want to squeeze in one last question, and maybe Jimena, Andrea, or Pashendra, you can jump in on this one. And this is really about sort of ensuring the longer term sustainability of vertical integration efforts. I think we've heard a lot about the types of capacities and needs and investments that are needed to make sure vertical integration happens. But how do we make sure it really continues over the longer term, and making sure that vertical integration is inclusive and is equitable? Are there any sort of last thoughts that you would share with our audience here about how to ensure vertical integration continues over the longer term?
If I may, I would say that it's very important to, first of all, be patient with the local processes. Local processes take time, and integral and cross-cutting coordination, stakeholder coordination is very important, and it's fundamental to set the basis for effective long-term changes. So we need to make sure that resources that come to support those processes think that it will take some time, and also given the situations that happen. I mean, just to bring the example of COVID, which basically puts on hold many of the commitments and also increases the challenges that many developing countries face. It's quite important to be flexible to respond to those needs long term. So I would say increase investment long term and support those processes through the time that they take, because those are the basis for long-term solutions.
Thanks. Any last thoughts from you, Jimena or Pashendra, on this?
I'll just quickly add to the forces, the importance of forces, maybe probably better collaboration, better coordination, and then the communication aspect as well, we already discussed, and addressing capacity deficit, mainly at the local and subnational scale. So I'll just wrap up there. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Jimena, not to put you on the spot, but I want to give you an opportunity to say something.
Yeah. Sí, en línea con lo que ya estábamos diciendo, quizás más allá también de la perspectiva de los donantes, el poder tratar de desarrollar estructuras que faciliten la articulación entre los procesos de planificación de largo plazo que se hacen en las comunidades, en procesos como los que estamos haciendo, y el enfoque mucho más en proyectos. Creo que sí podemos mejorar a nivel de cómo, inclusive a nivel de los donantes, se está viendo esta perspectiva para que no haya una duplicación de procesos en el momento que se hacen procesos de planificación de largo plazo, pero luego se hacen requisitos de proyectos con una perspectiva más cortoplacista que inclusive a veces no mantiene una lógica tan similar a la que se maneja a largo plazo. Entonces, creo que también es un buen espacio siempre de reflexión de cómo los requisitos de los donantes pueden también estar mejor alineados al pensar en el largo plazo y en temas más sistémicos. Muchas gracias.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the panel discussion and really want to thank all of our panelists for a fantastic discussion. And maybe I'll hand it over to you, Hash, for some closing remarks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and thank you, dear panelists. I think this was really a great discussion. I think we all enjoyed really listening to you. I mean, sharing your valuable insights. And basically also highlighting, I think, the common challenges that we face in this very complex area, but some, unfortunately, topic obviously that will stay with us and will most likely increase in relevance. So a big thank you to all the speakers, a big thank you to all the people that attended and listened to all of us and asked questions and interacted in one way or the other. It's really great to see. I think the wrapping up and that you facilitated of the panelists was super insightful. I mean, issues that I heard was basically really the crucial importance of generating and sharing of good practice. I mean, the critical role that intermediaries play. I think many of you mentioned the communication and the quality of communication that is really necessary for building trust, as Patrick was referring to kind of facilitate the long-term processes. Andrea was just mentioning this, which are necessary. So it's about the quality of communication, certainly. I think many of you mentioned issues of values, social justice, and ethical issues in order to, allow the voices basically of the most affected and most vulnerable groups to be heard. So that's to say, and I think Andrea Shemira mentioned also the fact that obviously we here on the donor community side need to further, I think, change and make sure that our processes are really up to scratch and both not only develop project proposals, but also kind of change the way we deliver and assist our partners in their implementation. So with that, big thank you obviously also to my dear colleagues from ISD and Daniel, thanks to you and for an excellent moderation. I would like to thank my colleague Taka, obviously, who was a driving force for this webinar as well. And then big thank you also to Catherine Bush from IISD, Sam Proteau, and Jessica Voorhees here from the OECD for the great support in the background of this webinar. And with that, on behalf of both organizing organizations, big thank you for everybody who contributed, and we look forward to collaborating with you in future. All the best, and bonne soirée, or have a nice day and a good day wherever you are. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.